All right, welcome back to History and Coffee with part two of Wild Bill Hickok, the real story. And if you haven't seen part one, you're going to want to watch that before you watch this. So, cattail. Anyway, so this is the portion of Wild Bill's life where he's working as a lawman and mostly as a marshal. And the term, the job of marshal in the Old West is a lot different than I guess what we would consider it to be today. Now, back then, you did have federal and state marshals, which were very much similar to the U.S. marshals we have around still today. But back then, you had a job that was called town marshal, and it was really more of a essentially you would be hired by a committee at the town, business owners and local politicians. Usually the sheriff would have a say in it as he was an elected official. And then other times, you would be elected to the position by townspeople in a general vote. But your jurisdiction was essentially just that town. And really the sort of law enforcement heavy lifting, if you will, like, solving crimes and, this and that. Really, that was the job of the sheriff and his deputies. What the bouncer did, or I'm sorry, Freudian slip, what the marshal did was essentially act as a bouncer for the town. He would wear a gun on the outside of his clothing in plain view, which was something that really wasn't as common back then as you would think, especially in towns. Most towns had ordinances against carrying a firearm, and there's a whole bunch of reasons for that. But anyway, so the marshal would wear a gun and he would patrol the town. There might be more than one. Usually it was just one, depending on the size of the town. And he was just sort of an on-the-spot, roving patrol, make sure if shit pops off, there's somebody there who can handle it. Not necessarily, somebody that needs to be well-versed in the law or, somebody, really valuable, like the sheriff who has other responsibilities, but somebody who can just is a rough guy and, basically knock a few heads together and, everything goes by the way, sort of a bouncer, a town bouncer. And this is mainly what Wild Bill did in his time as a law enforcement officer. He was really well suited to it. There's a number of interesting sort of things. First of all, the marshal was generally not supposed to be gunning people down, but an unfortunate consequence of having the reputation that Wild Bill had, especially from his time in the Civil War and, sort of the Harper's Weekly magazine articles about him that had circulated around, there was a lot of real tough, dumb young kids who wanted a piece of him. He was sort of the bullseye on the dartboard. You get bragging rights if you were to be the one that took out Wild Bill, and this led to people drawing on him pretty regularly and getting themselves killed. And there's a lot of sort of debate about this sort of, Wild Bill, gunned down all these people, and why did he do that? And if you look at the court documents, because again, people think the Old West, that two men, they shot it out and it was over, and that man walked away and the other man didn't. Well, no, there was trials and investigations and all kinds of shit, and it was all well documented. And I would say the majority, if not all, of the shootings that Bill was involved in as a marshal, there was witnesses stating that the other people drew first. And again, this is just, the testament to Bill's skill with a pistol. He would walk into these situations and a gun would get pulled on him and he would just draw and fire so fast that the other person just really didn't even stand a chance. And there's an interesting incident with a gentleman by the name of Phil Coe, who ran a saloon. And again, this is one of these cattle towns in Texas. I believe it was Abilene at the time. But he decided he was going to gin up some business for his establishment by painting a rather, what's described in the historical documents as a lewd picture on the front of his building, a very large lewd picture, which amounted to a sizable portrait of a nude woman in a very compromising position. And there was always this struggle between sort of these business owners who ran these businesses that were questionable, and the people who were trying to develop the town into an actual town. And the politicians and other business owners of the town got together, and they told Mr. Coe to paint over this because it's obscene, and there are families living in this town, etc. And Phil basically told him to fuck off. So they asked Bill to go and talk to him. He was the acting marshal at the time. He was elected in this particular case. And so he talked to him and was like, you need to cover this shit up. And, Phil Coe told him to fuck off. So he went ahead and got a paintbrush and painted some undies on the naked lady. And that should have been really it. But Phil took offense to this. And it led to another shootout. And this was a real turning point in Wild Bill's life. He was accosted by several gentlemen. And in the fray, one of his own deputies running to aid him in the darkness Bill mistook him for another assailant and turned and fired and killed him. And really that was kind of the end of Bill's law enforcement career. And not because, again, this is sort of, gives you an idea of who Bill was. It wasn't necessarily because he couldn't find work as a marshal after that, because he certainly could have. And that was always a sought-after job, especially for someone like him. And it was clear that this was an accidental killing by almost everybody who was there. But you could tell that this affected him, and he really just sort of walked away from that life after this. And, by accounts, these men were good friends, and it's an unfortunate circumstance. And, there's been a lot of criticism lumped on Bill by this, but you have to understand, in the heat of combat, after being accosted by several individuals, you're a little keyed up, I imagine that most people, we see this, of course, happen with police officers today. There's incidents of them, letting loose with, an obscene amount of bullets, or accidentally killing somebody who's unarmed because, stress, especially combat stress, it makes you stupid. And so, again, regardless of all this, Bill did take responsibility for this and sort of walked away from his life as a law enforcement officer and a town marshal. It was during this time that he met an older woman. Well, at this time he was older himself. A woman by the name of Agnes Thatcher, who actually ran a circus. And by all accounts, the two fell in love and were married. And also during this time, you sort of have this bullshit about Wild Bill sort of having a thing with Calamity Jane. But I can tell you, I mean, there's still a lot of dispute about that. But I 100% believe that is not true. The vast majority of those rumors are based on Calamity Jane's own writings. And I'd say about 95% of that itself is proven bullshit. Calamity Jane, while a very interesting figure, was pretty much just a drunken liar. And I hate to say it like that, because there are people who, sort of, and she did do some crazy shit now. And she did wind up in jail quite a bit. But a lot of the stuff that gets attributed to her sort of folk hero status is untrue, unfortunately. And I could do a video on that some other time. But anyway, so the other thing, too, about this woman, people believe that Bill married her for her money. You want to help? And that's another thing that I would have to say is definitely untrue. There's a great deal of letters that survive between the two, and they are very romantic and very sort of leads me to believe that this was a real romance and a real marriage, not necessarily a money thing. And again, judging by Wild Bill's character up until now, I don't think that he would be the type to do something like that. Now, also at this time, Bill is getting old. He sort of really lost his taste for, sort of the violence that has defined the vast majority of his life. And something from his past sort of comes back to help him out a little bit. Now, I had talked in my last video about how Bill, when he was a young man, had rode with Jayhawkers in the Missouri-Kansas border war. During that time, he rescued a young boy from a group of bushwhackers. And that young boy turned out to be Buffalo Bill, who later, of course, went on to be an Indian scout and start his famous Wild West show. So Bill, Bill got an issue. He's getting older. He's got some glaucoma going on, and he's starting to lose his vision. And he runs into Buffalo Bill, who offers him a position with his Wild West show. And at this point, Wild Bill definitely needs the money. He's sort of getting deeper into this gambling addiction of his. And I believe that you can see as his sort of, soldier lawman life subsides, his gambling life really sort of increases. And it's, again, I think it's this issue of being in this constant state of exhilaration and rush, and you need something to fill that void. And we see that a lot today with soldiers returning from deployments. They do stupid shit. They drink too much, they gamble, they fight, and it's because they're trying to substitute that adrenaline rush that you get in combat. And I believe that Bill was absolutely suffering from something similar. And again, gambling was sort of filling that void. So Wild Bill decides to sign up with Buffalo Bill's Wild West show, and it does not go very well. At one point, he even shoots out one of the stage lights, and basically he's like, you know what, that's it. He sort of thanks Buffalo Bill for his time, but he's not an actor. He's sort of the real deal. He's not good at pretending to be himself, basically, or what the people he's not good at meeting the expectations of the folk hero status that have sort of grown up around himself. And so he decides to head off for Deadwood, up in the Dakota territories, or I believe it was a state at this. I don't remember. Anyway, so he decides he's going to go strike a claim and try his hand at mining silver. And there's some sort of letters back and forth between him and his wife. And his wife did have a good amount of money. She owned a circus. At this point, it was in the care of her daughter, but Bill could have actually lived a pretty cozy sort of urban life with this woman, but I don't think that he was capable of that, really. I think that there was always sort of that wanting that one last adventure, or getting out there and getting your hands dirty. I don't think he could have sat on his ass and been an old married man. Just not the type. So it's at this point where sort of the real last act in the story of Wild Bill unfolds. And again, it's really one of the biggest clues to the character of the man. Wild Bill is sitting in a card game with several other gentlemen in Deadwood in a saloon, and one of those men is named Jack McCall, and he's a younger guy, and he's been drinking, and he just gets his ass kicked and basically loses all of his money at poker. And he's off sort of fuming and brooding, and Wild Bill notices this and goes up to him, puts his arm around him and says, "Hey, this is what gambling's about. Sometimes you lose. You can't get emotional about it." And he actually takes, and again, Wild Bill didn't have that much money. He buys the guy a drink, and he buys him breakfast and sort of gives him some advice and says, "Hey, you practice, you'll get better at cards. Sometimes you win, sometimes you lose. It's just how it goes." And sort of leaves it at that, pats him on the back, walks off. But what Bill didn't know was that Jack McCall took all of this as an insult. Basically, here's Bill trying to give him sort of a paternal bit of advice. You know, he's been at it for a while. And this is, again, the kind of guy Bill was. He would, and again, lost to history, you know, he would go out of his way to sort of help people out when they needed it. He was a nice guy, you know. And Jack McCall took this the wrong way. And of course, I believe it was 2 days later, Bill was sitting down at a card game, holding his hand of aces and eights, the famous dead man's hand, when Jack McCall came in, put a pistol to the back of his head, and executed him. And that was the end of Wild Bill Hickok. And it's interesting, you know, a lot of this guy's character is just, you know, the sort of the quick draw gunfighter, really overshadowed he was a nice guy. And while that's not all impressive, if you consider the environment and way in which he was raised, that kind of constant cycle of violence and stress generally doesn't make nice guys. So not only was he a nice guy, but he had a real strong moral character. And so, you know, and as far as his death being tragic, somebody who is very used to being in those situations, sort of getting old maybe isn't the best thing for them, you know? I think that we remember Wild Bill a little bit better than we would have had there been an old Wild Bill floating around. So, you know, historically speaking, and for the sake of the story, and possibly even for the sake of Bill himself, he died the death he was supposed to. And yeah, that's really the whole real story right there. So thanks for watching, and hope you learned something.